Lyra didn't know that the man watching her from across the crowded ballroom was the Alpha King of the Northern Territories. She didn't know that he had travelled 300 miles just to attend her engagement celebration. And she certainly didn't know that the moment their eyes met, everything she thought she understood about her future would shatter like glass. All she knew was that the emerald engagement ring on her finger felt heavier with each passing hour, and that Lord Marcus Blackwood's hand on her waist made her skin crawl. "Smile, darling," Marcus murmured against her ear, his breath reeking of wine and something darker. "Everyone is watching the happy couple." Lyra forced her lips to curve upward, the expression feeling as false as the life she was about to commit to. Around them, the nobility of Ashford swirled in silks and satins, their laughter sharp as crystal against the marble floors of her family's estate. The chandeliers cast everything in golden light, beautiful and warm, but Lyra felt cold down to her bones. "Of course," she whispered back, lifting her left hand to adjust her necklace. The emerald caught the light, sending green fire across her pale skin. It was beautiful. It was expensive. It was everything she had never wanted. Marcus's fingers tightened possessively on her waist. "Good girl. Now be useful and fetch me another brandy. And one for Lord Ashworth while you're at it. The servants are being sluggish tonight." Heat flamed in Lyra's cheeks, but she nodded. Around them, conversations paused. She could feel the subtle smirks, the raised eyebrows. Everyone knew what Marcus was doing, reminding her of her place, reminding them all that despite the fine dress and the family name, she was still the girl whose father had sold her to pay his debts. "Right away," she managed, stepping back from his embrace. "That's my girl," Marcus said loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "Always so eager to please, like the servant she was born to be." The words landed like physical blows, but Lyra kept her smile intact. She had learned long ago that showing pain only made men like Marcus hungrier for more. She made her way through the crowd toward the refreshment table, her borrowed silk gown whispering against her legs. Borrowed like everything else in her life. The dress belonged to her cousin. The jewellery was Marcus's family pieces. Even the smile on her face belonged to someone else. The night air called to her through the open terrace doors, and instead of heading to the brandy, she turned toward escape. Just for a moment, just long enough to remember how to breathe. The garden was a sanctuary of jasmine and moonlight. Lyra pressed her back against the cool stone wall and finally let her shoulders drop. Here, in the darkness, she didn't have to be the grateful bride-to-be. Here, she could be what she really was, terrified. Heavy thoughts for such a beautiful evening. Lyra's heart slammed against her ribs. She spun around to find a man emerging from the shadows near the fountain, and her breath caught in her throat. He was tall, broader through the shoulders than any man had a right to be, with dark hair that looked like it had been touched by moonlight, but it was his eyes that made her stomach flip. Silver blue, like storm clouds shot through with lightning, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel exposed despite her high neckline. "I'm sorry," she stammered, pressing one hand to her chest where something strange was happening. A warmth, golden and spreading, like honey poured into her bloodstream. "I didn't realize anyone else was out here." "Don't apologize." His voice was deep, roughened with something she couldn't name. Gardens are meant to be enjoyed, especially by beautiful women trying to escape. "I'm not trying to escape." The lie fell automatically from her lips. "I'm simply taking some air." He moved closer, and the warmth in her chest intensified. This was impossible. She didn't even know his name. But something in her recognized something in him, like calling to like across a crowded room. "Of course," he said softly. "Fresh air, very important at engagement celebrations." Lyra's eyes widened. "How did you—" "The ring." He nodded toward her left hand. "Rather hard to miss. Emerald surrounded by diamonds. Family heirloom, I'd guess. Blackwood family crest etched into the band." Self-consciously, Lyra curled her fingers, trying to hide the ostentatious thing. "You know Marcus? We've met." Something dangerous flickered in those storm-coloured eyes. Interesting man, very possessive of his belongings. "I'm not a belonging," Lyra said sharply, then immediately regretted the outburst. She didn't know this man. For all she knew, he was one of Marcus's friends, testing her loyalty. But instead of looking offended, the stranger smiled. It transformed his entire face, making him impossibly more handsome and infinitely more dangerous. "No," he agreed, "you're not, though I suspect some people have trouble remembering that." Before Lyra could respond, Marcus's voice cut through the night like a whip crack. "Lyra, where the hell are you?" She jumped, guilt flooding through her, even though she had done nothing wrong. The stranger's eyes narrowed, his attention shifting toward the terrace doors where Marcus would appear at any moment. "I have to go," Lyra whispered, already backing toward the house. "Of course you do." The stranger's voice was gentle, but there was steel underneath it. "Duty calls." "Lyra." Marcus's voice was closer now, angry. She turned and hurried toward the terrace, her heart hammering. Behind her, she could feel the stranger watching, his presence like a physical weight between her shoulder blades. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his face flushed with wine and irritation. "There you are. I've been looking everywhere." His gaze flicked past her to the garden. "Who were you talking to?" "No one," Lyra said quickly. "I was just—" But Marcus was already striding past her, scanning the shadows. The stranger was gone, vanished as if he had never been there at all. Only the lingering warmth in Lyra's chest proved she hadn't imagined him. "Strange," Marcus muttered. Then his fingers closed around Lyra's upper arm, tight enough to bruise. "Next time, tell me before you wander off. I don't like not knowing where my things are." "Of course," Lyra whispered. "I'm sorry." Marcus's grip softened marginally. "Come, Lord Ashworth is asking about the wedding date. We need to present a united front." He guided her back into the ballroom, his hand possessive on her lower back. The crowd parted for them, smiles and congratulations flowing like wine, but Lyra barely heard any of it. That strange golden warmth was still spreading through her chest, and she found herself scanning the room for storm-coloured eyes. She didn't see him until Marcus led her to the receiving line near the main entrance. A group of late arrivals was being announced, their names ringing out over the music and conversation. "Lord Adrian Wolfe," the butler intoned, "Alpha King of the Northern Territories." The ballroom seemed to take a collective breath. Conversations faltered. Even the musicians missed a note, and there he was, the stranger from the garden. He was dressed in formal black now, every inch the powerful ruler. But those eyes were the same, and when they found hers across the room, that golden warmth exploded into something close to fire. Alpha King, the most powerful shifter in 5 kingdoms, unmarked, unmated, and he was looking at her like she was the only person in the room. Marcus's hand tightened on her back as he stepped forward, pulling her with him. "Your Majesty, what an unexpected honour." Adrian's gaze flicked to Marcus, cool and assessing. "Lord Blackwood." Then his attention returned to Lyra, and she felt something in her chest pull tight, like a golden thread being drawn taut. "And you must be the bride-to-be." "Lyra Ashford," Marcus said before she could speak, "soon to be Lyra Blackwood." He lifted her left hand, displaying the emerald ring like a trophy. "We're to be married next month." Adrian's eyes fixed on the ring, and for just a moment something predatory flashed across his features. When he looked up, his smile was perfectly polite and absolutely lethal. "Beautiful ring," he said softly. "Pity it's on the wrong finger." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus's face darkened, but he couldn't openly confront an Alpha King, not without starting a war. "I beg your pardon," Marcus said carefully. Adrian stepped closer, and Lyra caught his scent, pine and winter, and something wild that made her wolf sense sing, despite the fact that she had never shifted, had never even known she could. "Nothing at all," Adrian said, but his eyes never left Lyra's. "Simply an observation. Sometimes what appears to be a perfect fit isn't." And in that moment, Lyra knew with devastating certainty that nothing in her life would ever be simple again. The morning sun streamed through the library windows when the butler appeared at Lyra's side, his expression carefully neutral. "Miss Ashford, there's a gentleman here to see your father. He's requested you join them in the library." Lyra looked up from her book, her stomach clenching. After last night, after those storm-coloured eyes and that impossible warmth that still seemed to live beneath her ribs, she had hoped for a quiet day to sort through her confusion. Did he give his name? "Lord Wolfe, miss." The book tumbled from her hands. "Adrian, here, in her home." The golden thread in her chest pulled tight, and she pressed her fingers against her sternum, trying to contain the sensation. "I see. Thank you, Thomas." She made her way through the familiar halls on unsteady legs, her simple morning dress feeling inadequate. What could the Alpha King possibly want with her father? What could he want with her? The library door stood slightly ajar, and she could hear the low rumble of masculine voices within, her father's nervous laughter, and underneath it, that deep, roughened tone that made something in her chest sing. She knocked softly and entered. Adrian stood near the tall windows, hands clasped behind his back, looking perfectly at ease among her father's collection of dusty books. He had traded last night's formal attire for riding clothes that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the lean power of his frame. When he turned at her entrance, those silver-blue eyes found hers immediately, and the warmth in her chest bloomed into something closer to fire. "Lyra," he said, and just her name in his voice made her knees weak. "Thank you for joining us." Her father bustled forward, practically vibrating with nervous energy. "My dear, Lord Wolfe has come to discuss some business opportunities, trade agreements with the Northern Territories." "Business opportunities?" Lyra repeated faintly. Adrian's mouth curved in what might have been a smile. "Among other things, I was hoping to speak with you privately, Miss Ashford, if your father permits, of course." The request hung in the air like a challenge. Lyra could see the war playing out across her father's features, his desperate need for Adrian's favour warring with propriety and fear of Marcus's reaction. That is—" her father's hands fluttered helplessly. "Perhaps with a chaperone." "I don't require a chaperone," Adrian said quietly, but there was steel underneath the words. "And I think Miss Ashford is capable of making her own decisions about whom she speaks with." Lyra straightened, something defiant sparking to life in her chest. "I would be happy to speak with Lord Wolfe, father." Her father's face went pale, but he nodded jerkily. "Of course, yes, I'll be in my study if you need anything." He practically fled, leaving Lyra alone with the most powerful man in 5 kingdoms. The silence stretched between them, charged and dangerous. Adrian moved to the seating area near the fireplace, but he didn't sit. Instead, he turned to face her fully, and Lyra felt pinned by the intensity of his gaze. "You're nervous," he observed. "I'm engaged," she said, lifting her left hand so the emerald caught the light. "Speaking privately with another man is complicated." "Is it?" Adrian moved closer, and that golden warmth in her chest intensified. "Even when that man is your mate?" The word hung between them like a physical thing. Lyra's breath caught, and she took a step back. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do." His voice was gentle now, patient. "You felt it last night, that pull, that recognition, the warmth that lives right here." He touched his own chest, just over his heart. Lyra's hand flew to the same spot on her own body, where that strange golden thread seemed to originate. "That's impossible." "Is it?" Adrian's eyes never left hers. You've never shifted, have you? Never had anyone explain what it means to be a wolf, even a dormant one." "I'm human," Lyra whispered, but even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true, had always known, somewhere deep down, that she was different, that the way she could sense emotions, the way she could hear heartbeats and smell fear, wasn't normal. "You're half-blood," Adrian said gently. "Your grandmother was a wolf. The bloodline skipped your father's generation, but not yours." He paused, letting her process. "You're my mate, Lyra, my destined partner, the other half of my soul." The words should have sounded like madness. Instead, they sounded like coming home. "No," she shook her head, backing toward the door. "No, I'm promised to Marcus. I'm going to marry him next month. I gave my word." "Promises can be broken." Adrian's voice was steady, implacable. "Some bonds cannot." "You don't understand." Lyra's voice cracked with desperation. "My family owes Marcus £20,000. If I don't marry him, the debt will be paid. You can't just—" She stopped, staring at him. "What did you say?" "The debt will be paid," Adrian repeated. "Today, if necessary. Money is not a reason to sacrifice your happiness." "But Marcus doesn't own you, no matter what he's told you, no matter what contract he's signed with your father." Adrian's eyes flashed with something dangerous. "You are not property to be bought and sold." Lyra sank into the nearest chair, her legs no longer steady enough to hold her. "This is insane. You're the Alpha King. You could have any woman in the kingdom. Why would you want—" "You," Adrian finished softly. "Because you're mine. Because I've spent 3 centuries waiting for you. Because when I look at you, I can finally breathe." The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Lyra stared at him, this powerful, dangerous man who was looking at her like she was something precious. "I don't understand," she whispered. "You don't have to understand. Not yet." Adrian moved to the chair across from hers and sat, bringing himself to her eye level. "But I need you to know that what you felt last night, what you're feeling now, it's real. We're real. And you have choices, Lyra, more choices than you've ever been allowed to believe." Before she could respond, the library door burst open. Marcus stood in the doorway, his face flushed with anger and something that might have been fear. "Lyra! What the hell is going on? The servant said—" He stopped short when he saw Adrian, and his face went ashen. "Your Majesty, I didn't realize you were here." Adrian rose with fluid grace, every line of his body radiating controlled power. "Lord Blackwood, how fortuitous. I was hoping to speak with you." Marcus's eyes darted between Adrian and Lyra, suspicion and possessiveness warring in his expression. "About what exactly?" "About your engagement." Adrian's voice was perfectly polite and absolutely lethal. "And whether it's in Miss Ashford's best interests to proceed." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus stepped forward, his hand instinctively reaching for Lyra. "I fail to see how my engagement is any concern of yours, Your Majesty." Adrian's eyes tracked the movement, and something predatory flickered across his features. "Everything that concerns my mate concerns me." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Marcus went white, then red, then white again. "Your mate?" His voice was strangled. "That's impossible. She's mine. We're to be married in 3 weeks. The contracts are signed." "Contracts can be dissolved," Adrian said mildly, "especially when they were signed under false pretenses." "False pretenses?" Marcus sputtered. "What are you talking about?" "Did you tell Miss Ashford about her wolf blood when you negotiated for her hand? Did you explain what it would mean to bind herself to a human when her true mate was out there waiting?" Marcus's silence was answer enough. Adrian turned to Lyra, his expression gentle despite the tension crackling in the air. "The choice is yours, sweetheart. It always has been, but now you know what your options really are." Lyra looked between them, Marcus with his familiar cruelty and possessiveness, Adrian with his impossible promises and storm-coloured eyes. The ring on her finger felt like a shackle, but the golden warmth in her chest felt like freedom. I need time, she whispered. Of course you do. Adrian's voice was patient, understanding. Take all the time you need, but Lyra... He waited until her eyes met his. Don't let fear make the decision for you. You're stronger than they've told you, braver than they've let you believe. He moved toward the door, pausing only when he reached Marcus. For a moment, the two men stood face to face, and the air between them crackled with barely contained violence. She wears your ring, Adrian said quietly, but she dreams of something else. The question is, will you force her to stay, or will you let her choose? With that, he was gone, leaving Lyra alone with Marcus and the echo of possibilities she had never dared to imagine. Marcus turned to her, his face twisted with fury and something that might have been desperation. You're not seriously considering this madness? Lyra looked down at the emerald on her finger, then back up at the man she was supposed to marry. For the first time in her life, she didn't immediately apologize or try to soothe his anger. I need time to think, she said quietly. You need to remember who you belong to, Marcus snarled, and what will happen to your precious family if you don't. But even his threats couldn't quite dim the golden warmth spreading through her chest or the echo of Adrian's words. You have choices, Lyra, more choices than you've ever been allowed to believe. The flowers arrived the next morning, white roses and jasmine, arranged with a delicate hand and accompanied by a book of poetry. No note, no signature. But Lyra knew who had sent them. The golden warmth in her chest pulsed in recognition, even before she caught the faint scent of pine and winter that seemed to cling to the petals. Secret admirer? Marcus's voice cut through her moment of wonder like a blade. Lyra startled, clutching the flowers to her chest. I don't know who sent them. Don't you? Marcus plucked the card from her hands before she could stop him. His face darkened when he found it blank. How mysterious, though I can't imagine who would be bold enough to send flowers to another man's fiancée. The threat in his voice was unmistakable. Lyra forced herself to set the flowers aside with apparent indifference, but her fingers lingered on the soft petals. It's probably nothing. A mistake. Yes, Marcus said slowly. A mistake, one that won't be repeated. The second day brought books, a collection of fairy tales, each story carefully marked with passages about brave women who chose their own destinies. Hidden between the pages, pressed flowers that still held the scent of mountain air. Marcus found them, of course. He always found them. You seem to have quite the mystery correspondent, he said, his voice deceptively light as he flipped through the marked pages. Someone with very specific interests in women's independence. Lyra kept her eyes fixed on her embroidery, though her hands trembled slightly. I have no idea who keeps sending these things. Of course you don't. Marcus closed the book with a sharp snap. Which is why I've taken the liberty of posting guards at the gates, to ensure no more mysterious packages find their way to you. The third day, Adrian himself appeared in the garden. Lyra had been sitting by the fountain, trying to lose herself in her sketching, when his voice made her heart leap into her throat. You received the books. She looked up to find him leaning against an oak tree not 20 feet away, looking perfectly at ease despite the fact that he had somehow bypassed Marcus's guards. In daylight he was even more devastating, tall and broad and dangerous, with those storm-coloured eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. You shouldn't be here, she whispered, glancing nervously toward the house. Probably not, Adrian agreed, moving closer. But I find myself remarkably unconcerned with propriety where you're concerned. Marcus will what? Adrian's voice was soft, but there was steel underneath it. Hurt you for speaking to another man? Lock you away until you learn to be grateful for his attention? Lyra's silence was answer enough. Adrian's expression darkened, something predatory flickering behind his eyes. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. How long has he been keeping you prisoner in your own home? I'm not a prisoner, Lyra said quickly, then flushed at how hollow the words sounded. I'm simply preparing for marriage. It's natural to spend time at home. When did you last leave the estate? Lyra opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. When had she last left? The engagement party 3 nights ago had been here at her father's house. Before that. I see. Adrian's voice was gentle now, patient. And your friends? When did you last see them? I don't... Lyra's throat felt tight. Marcus says it's better if I focus on my new life with him. That old friendships will only complicate things. Complicate things, Adrian repeated softly, or give you people to turn to when you need help. The words hit too close to home. Lyra looked away, focusing on the fountain rather than those knowing eyes. You don't understand. My family needs this marriage. The debts could be paid tomorrow. Adrian moved to sit on the fountain's edge, close enough that she could catch his scent, feel the warmth radiating from his body. I told you that before. Money is not a cage, Lyra. Only fear is. It's not that simple. Isn't it? Adrian's voice was quiet, hypnotic. What if I told you that I've spent 3 centuries waiting for someone to look at me the way you do? What if I told you that every day without you feels like drowning? Would that change anything? Lyra's breath caught. You can't say things like that. Why not? Because it makes you want something you've convinced yourself you can't have. Adrian reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her hand where it rested on her sketchbook. Because it makes you remember that you have a choice. The contact sent electricity shooting up her arm, and she gasped. The golden warmth in her chest exploded into something that felt like coming alive after years of holding her breath. I've given my word, she whispered. To whom? To Marcus, who treats you like property? To your father, who sold you to pay his gambling debts? Or to yourself because you're terrified of wanting something real? Each word was a knife between her ribs, cutting through the careful lies she had built around her situation. Lyra pulled her hand away, wrapping her arms around herself. You don't know what you're asking. I'm asking you to trust me. Adrian's voice was soft, urgent. I'm asking you to let me show you what it feels like to be cherished instead of owned, to be chosen instead of bought. And what happens when you get tired of me? The words tumbled out before she could stop them, raw and honest and devastating. What happens when you remember that you're the Alpha King and I'm nobody? When you realise that a half-blood bastard with no dowry isn't worthy of... Stop! Adrian's voice cracked like a whip, making her flinch. When he spoke again, his tone was gentler but no less fierce. Don't you ever call yourself nobody. Don't you ever question your worth based on what other people have told you. But I am, Lyra whispered. I'm nothing special. I have nothing to offer someone like you. You have everything. Adrian moved closer, his eyes blazing with intensity. You have courage that shines like sunlight. You have a heart that stays soft despite everything they've done to break it. You have a soul that calls to mine across every barrier they've tried to build between us. His words wrapped around her like warmth, like safety, like everything she had never allowed herself to want. For a moment, she let herself imagine it. A life where someone looked at her the way Adrian was looking at her now. A life where she mattered. Then reality crashed back in. Marcus will never let me go, she said quietly. The contracts can be broken. The debts will be paid. My family will survive. They'll more than survive if you let me help them. Lyra stared at him. This impossible man offering impossible solutions to problems that had defined her entire life. Why? She whispered. Why would you do all of that for someone you barely know? Adrian was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. Because 300 years ago, I made a choice that cost me everything. I let duty and honour and other people's expectations keep me from the woman I loved. I watched her die because I was too proud to fight for her, too convinced that doing the right thing mattered more than being happy. Lyra's heart clenched at the pain in his voice. I swore I would never make that mistake again, Adrian continued, that if I ever found my mate, I would move heaven and earth to keep her safe, to keep her with me. His eyes found hers, storm grey and fierce. I won't lose you the way I lost her, not to duty, not to fear, not to men who see you as property instead of the miracle you are. Before Lyra could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps made them both freeze. Adrian was on his feet in an instant, moving with fluid grace to put himself between Lyra and the house. Marcus appeared around the corner of the garden path, flanked by 2 guards. His face was a mask of cold fury. "Your Majesty," he said with false civility, "what a surprise to find you in my fiancé's garden." "Lord Blackwood." Adrian's voice was perfectly polite and absolutely lethal. "Lovely estate, though the security seems to have some gaps." Marcus's jaw tightened. Indeed, gaps that will be addressed immediately. His eyes flicked to Lyra, who had risen from her seat by the fountain. "Lyra, darling, please go inside. I need to speak with His Majesty privately." "Actually," Adrian said smoothly, "I was hoping Miss Ashford might show me the rest of the gardens. I'm considering similar landscaping for my own estate." "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Marcus said through gritted teeth. "Lyra has other obligations this afternoon." "Do you?" Adrian asked, turning to look at her directly. "Have other obligations?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Lyra could feel Marcus's anger radiating from across the garden, could practically hear his threats forming. But Adrian was looking at her with those storm-coloured eyes, and the golden warmth in her chest was pulling her toward him like a tide. She started, then stopped. For the first time in her life she had a choice. A real choice. "I would be happy to show you the gardens, Your Majesty." Marcus's face went white, then red. "Lyra will be perfectly safe with me," Adrian finished calmly. He offered her his arm, a gesture that was both courtly and claiming. "Shall we?" Lyra looked at the offered arm, then at Marcus's furious face, then back at Adrian's patient, encouraging expression. The emerald ring on her finger felt heavier than ever, but the golden thread in her chest was singing. She took Adrian's arm. They walked in silence for several minutes, leaving Marcus and his guards behind. Only when they were safely out of earshot did Adrian speak. "That was brave." "That was stupid," Lyra corrected, but she didn't let go of his arm. "He'll make me pay for this." "Not if you don't go back to him." The words hung between them, heavy with possibility and terror. Lyra stopped walking, forcing Adrian to stop with her. "You're asking me to give up everything I've ever known." "I'm asking you to choose the life you want, instead of the one they've chosen for you." Adrian turned to face her fully, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek with devastating gentleness. "I'm asking you to trust that you deserve more than a man who sees you as property." "I'm scared," she admitted in a whisper. "I know." Adrian's thumb brushed across her cheekbone, and Lyra felt herself leaning into the touch despite every instinct screaming at her to run. "But you're also the bravest person I've ever met. You've survived years of being told you're worthless, and you still have enough fire in you to defy him when it matters. What if you change your mind? What if—" "I won't." The certainty in his voice made her breath catch. "I've waited 3 centuries for you, Lyra. I'm not going anywhere." Before she could respond, he leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. The contact sent warmth flooding through her entire body, and for a moment she felt what it might be like to be cherished instead of owned. When he pulled back, his eyes were soft but determined. "Think about it," he said quietly. "But don't take too long. Men like Marcus don't like being defied, and I have a feeling our time is running out." The wedding dress had belonged to Marcus's dead mother. Lyra stared at herself in the mirror, drowning in yellowed lace and moth-eaten silk that smelled of lavender and decay. The gown hung on her frame like a shroud, the emerald ring weighing down her hand like a shackle. "You look beautiful, darling," her mother murmured, but her voice held no conviction. They both knew this was a funeral, not a celebration. "The carriage is ready," her father announced from the doorway, unable to meet her eyes. He had aged a decade in the 3 days since Adrian's last visit, since Marcus had moved the wedding date up yet again. We mustn't keep the guests waiting. Guests, as if anyone in that church would be there for her happiness rather than Marcus's display of ownership. Lyra nodded numbly and followed her parents downstairs, each step feeling like walking toward her execution. The golden warmth in her chest had dimmed to barely an ember over the past 3 days, smothered by Marcus's constant presence and the crushing weight of inevitability. Adrian hadn't come back. Perhaps he had finally realized what everyone else knew, that she wasn't worth fighting for. The carriage ride to St. Bartholomew's passed in a blur of countryside and her mother's nervous chatter about the weather. Lyra pressed her face to the window and watched the world slip by, memorizing it. After today, she would belong to Marcus completely. There would be no more gardens to hide in, no more moments of stolen freedom. The church loomed before them, its grey stone walls rising like a fortress. Carriages lined the street, and Lyra could see figures moving inside the sanctuary. The entire county had turned out to witness Lord Blackwood claim his prize. "Remember to smile," her mother whispered as they climbed the church steps, "and keep your eyes down during the ceremony. Modesty is—" Her words cut off abruptly as a commotion erupted from within the church. Voices raised in surprise, the scrape of chairs being pushed back, a woman's scandalized gasp. Lyra's heart slammed against her ribs. She knew, before she even saw him, what had caused the disturbance. The golden thread in her chest pulled taut, singing with recognition and desperate hope. They stepped through the church doors, and there he was. Adrian stood in the centre aisle, still dressed in riding clothes, his dark hair windswept, and his storm-coloured eyes blazing with determination. He looked like a conquering king who had ridden straight from battle, dangerous and magnificent, and completely out of place among the pastel silks and mourning coats of the wedding guests. The entire congregation had turned to stare, their faces a mixture of shock, fascination, and barely concealed excitement. This was better than any theatrical performance, the Alpha King himself interrupting a wedding. Marcus stood frozen at the altar, his face cycling through white to red to purple. "What is the meaning of this?" he sputtered. "This is a private ceremony, is it?" Adrian's voice carried easily through the vaulted space, calm and implacable. "Because I was under the impression that objections were welcomed during these proceedings." Father Morrison, the elderly priest officiating, looked like he might faint. "Your Majesty, This is highly irregular. So is forcing a woman into marriage against her will." Adrian's gaze found Lyra's across the church, and the warmth in her chest flared to life like a struck match. "But perhaps we should ask the bride what she wants." All eyes turned to Lyra, standing frozen in the doorway in her dead woman's dress. She could feel the weight of their attention, the hungry curiosity and anticipation. This was the moment that would define the rest of her life. "She belongs to me," Marcus said, his voice shaking with fury and desperation. "We have a contract. She wears my ring." "Contracts can be broken," Adrian said quietly, his eyes never leaving Lyra's, "and rings can be removed. The only question is whether she wants them to be." "You can't just—" Marcus started forward, but something in Adrian's stance made him stop. Even from across the church, the Alpha King's power was unmistakable, barely leashed violence wrapped in deceptive calm. "I can do whatever she asks me to," Adrian said softly. "The question is, what does she want?" The church fell silent, except for the thundering of Lyra's heartbeat in her ears. She could feel Marcus's rage, her parents' desperation, the congregation's avid curiosity. But underneath it all, she could feel Adrian's patient presence, his unwavering certainty that she was worth fighting for. "Lyra!" Marcus's voice cracked like a whip. Tell him you're mine!" The words hung in the air like a challenge. Lyra looked at the man she was supposed to marry, with his cruel mouth and possessive hands, then at the man who had travelled miles just to give her a choice. Her voice came out as barely a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. I don't belong to anyone. Marcus's face went ashen. What did you say? I said I don't belong to anyone. Lyra's voice grew stronger with each word. I'm not property to be bought and sold. I'm not a prize to be won. She lifted her left hand, the emerald ring catching the coloured light from the stained glass windows. And I'm tired of pretending that this means anything other than ownership. You ungrateful little... Marcus started toward her, but Adrian moved faster. In 3 swift strides he was between Marcus and Lyra, his presence like a wall of controlled power. When he spoke, his voice was soft and absolutely lethal. I would choose your next words very carefully. Marcus stopped, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. Around them, the congregation held its collective breath. She's mine, Marcus said through gritted teeth. The contracts were signed under false pretenses. Adrian's voice carried clearly through the church. Did you tell her father about her wolf blood when you negotiated for her hand? Did you explain what it would mean to bind a shifter to a human when her true mate existed? A gasp went up from the crowd. Lyra felt her face burn as all eyes turned to her again, but Adrian's presence at her back gave her strength. Her bloodline is irrelevant, Marcus snarled. She agreed to marry me. Under duress, to save her family from financial ruin. Adrian's voice was calm, factual. Hardly the foundation for a valid marriage contract. The law will side with an alpha king over a minor lord with questionable business practices. Adrian smiled, and it was a terrible, beautiful thing. Would you like to test that theory in court? Marcus opened and closed his mouth like a landed fish, clearly recognizing the trap he was in. Around them, the wedding guests murmured among themselves, the scandal of the century unfolding before their eyes. Father Morrison cleared his throat nervously. Perhaps we should postpone the ceremony while these matters are sorted out. No. Lyra's voice rang out clear and strong, surprising everyone, including herself. All eyes turned to her again, but this time she didn't shrink from the attention. There's nothing to sort out. She walked down the aisle with steady steps, her borrowed dress rustling against the stone floor. When she reached Adrian, she stopped and looked up into those storm-coloured eyes that had haunted her dreams. You came, she whispered. I told you I would. His voice was soft, meant only for her. The only question is whether you want me to stay. Lyra looked at him, this impossible, powerful man who had turned his world upside down for a half-blood, nobody with nothing to offer. Then she looked at Marcus, purple-faced with rage and humiliation. The choice was no choice at all. She pulled the emerald ring from her finger with deliberate slowness, feeling its weight for the last time. Then she held it out to Marcus, her hand steady despite the magnitude of what she was doing. I'm not yours, she said clearly. I never was, and I never will be. Marcus stared at the offered ring like it was a poisonous snake. You can't do this. Your family, the debts, will be taken care of, Adrian said calmly. As of this morning, Lord Ashford's debts have been paid in full. Miss Ashford is free to make her own choices. The church erupted in whispers and gasps. Lyra's parents, sitting in the front pew, looked like they might collapse from shock and relief. Marcus's face went through another cycle of colours before settling on a sickly grey. This isn't over, he said, his voice shaking with impotent fury. I'll contest this. I'll sue for breach of contract. You're welcome to try. Adrian's voice was pleasant, conversational. Though I should mention that interfering with an alpha's mate is considered an act of war under supernatural law. Are you prepared for those consequences? The threat hung in the air like a blade. Marcus looked around the church, perhaps finally realizing that he was alone, that no one would stand with him against the Alpha King. You'll regret this, he spat, but the words lacked conviction. Both of you. I doubt it. Adrian stepped closer to Lyra, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "But you're welcome to leave now, before I decide that your threats constitute a challenge." Marcus looked between them one last time, his face a mask of defeated rage. Then he turned on his heel and stalked from the church, the heavy doors slamming behind him with a sound like thunder. The silence that followed was deafening. Adrian turned to face Lyra fully, his eyes soft with something that might have been wonder. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and took the emerald ring from her trembling fingers. "Not any more," he said softly, echoing his words from their first meeting. Then he did something that made the entire congregation gasp in unison. He knelt before her, right there in the aisle of St. Bartholomew's, and pulled a different ring from his pocket. This one was simple, elegant, a band of white gold set with a stone that seemed to capture and hold the light like trapped starfire. When he slipped it onto her finger, it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. "Lyra Ashford," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the church. "Will you do me the honour of becoming my mate, my partner, my queen?" The words hung in the air like a prayer. Around them, the congregation held its breath, waiting for her answer. Lyra looked down at the man kneeling before her, this powerful, dangerous, impossible man who had seen something worthwhile in a woman everyone else had dismissed as nothing. The golden warmth in her chest exploded into something like sunlight, flooding every corner of her being with heat and hope and home. "Yes," she whispered. Then, louder, her voice ringing with certainty, "Yes." Adrian rose and cupped her face in his hands with devastating gentleness. When he kissed her, the church erupted in cheers and applause, but Lyra heard none of it. There was only the warmth of his mouth on hers, the strength of his arms around her, and the golden thread that bound them together singing with joy. When they finally broke apart, Adrian rested his forehead against hers. "Ready to go home?" he asked softly. Lyra looked into those storm-coloured eyes and smiled. For the first time in her life, she knew exactly where home was. "I've been ready for years," she said. "I just didn't know it yet." The chaos that erupted after Adrian's proposal was unlike anything Lyra had ever witnessed. Half the congregation surged forward to congratulate them, while the other half whispered frantically among themselves, already composing the letters they would send to spread the gossip. The Alpha King, engaged to a nobody from Ashford. It would be the scandal of the decade, but Lyra barely noticed the commotion. She was too focused on the way Adrian's hand felt in hers, steady and sure, and the way the simple ring on her finger seemed to pulse with warmth that matched the golden thread in her chest. "We should go," Adrian murmured against her ear, his voice cutting through the noise, "before this turns into more of a circus than it already has." Lyra nodded, suddenly desperate to escape the staring eyes and speculative whispers. But as they moved toward the church doors, her father appeared at her elbow, his face pale with a mixture of relief and terror. "Lyra, my dear," he stammered, that is, we should talk about the arrangements, the settlements." "Have been handled," Adrian said smoothly, his arms sliding around Lyra's waist in a gesture that was both protective and claiming. "Your debts are paid, Lord Ashford. Your daughter is free to choose her own path. But the paperwork, the contracts with Marcus, will be voided by my lawyers before the end of the week." Adrian's voice was polite but final. "You have nothing to worry about." Lyra's father opened and closed his mouth several times, clearly struggling to process the magnitude of what had just happened. £20,000 of debt vanished like morning mist. His daughter engaged to the most powerful man in 5 kingdoms. It was beyond his wildest dreams or worst nightmares. "I don't know how to thank you," he finally managed. "Take care of your family," Adrian said simply, "and never let anyone convince you that your daughter is anything less than extraordinary." With that, he guided Lyra through the crowd and out into the afternoon sunlight. A magnificent black carriage waited in the church courtyard, its gold trim gleaming and the Wolfe family crest emblazoned on the doors. It was the kind of conveyance that spoke of power and wealth beyond imagining. "Oh, is this really happening?" Lyra asked faintly as Adrian helped her into the plush interior. "Please tell me I'm not dreaming." "You're not dreaming." Adrian settled beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Though I understand if it feels surreal, your entire life just changed in the space of an hour." Lyra laughed, a slightly hysterical edge to the sound. "Changed, that's one way to put it." She looked down at the ring on her finger, then back up at Adrian's patient face. "What have I done?" "You chose yourself," Adrian said quietly. "For perhaps the first time in your life, you chose what you wanted instead of what everyone else wanted for you." The carriage lurched into motion, carrying them away from St. Bartholomew's and toward a future Lyra couldn't even begin to imagine. Through the window she watched the familiar countryside of her childhood roll past, knowing she might never see it again. "I don't know how to be a queen," she whispered. "You don't have to know yet." Adrian's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with an ease that felt like coming home. "You just have to know how to be yourself. But your people, they'll learn to love you the way I do." The simple certainty in his voice made her breath catch. "You have a strength in you, Lyra, that draws people in, a warmth that makes them want to be better than they are. That's not something that can be taught or faked. It's just who you are." Lyra stared at him, this impossible man who spoke about her like she was something precious instead of something broken. "You really see me that way?" "I see you exactly as you are," Adrian said softly. "Beautiful, brave, kind, worthy of every good thing this world has to offer." The words wrapped around her like a warm embrace, chasing away years of being told she was nothing, nobody, not enough. For the first time in her life, Lyra began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she might actually deserve the happiness that was being offered to her. The journey to Ravenshollow, Adrian's seat of power, took the better part of 3 days. They travelled in easy stages, stopping at comfortable inns where Adrian was treated with the deference due to royalty, and Lyra was welcomed with curious but respectful attention as his chosen mate. It was during their second evening, as they sat before the fire in a private parlour, that Adrian told her about his past, about Ilara, the woman he had loved and lost 3 centuries ago, about the political marriage his council had demanded, and how he had chosen duty over his heart, about watching Ilara die alone because he had been too proud to defy expectations and fight for their love. "I swore that night that if I ever found my mate, I would move heaven and earth to keep her safe," he said, staring into the flames. "That I would never again let other people's expectations cost me everything that mattered." Lyra reached for his hand, squeezing gently. "I'm sorry, she sounds like she was special." "She was." Adrian's fingers tightened around hers. "But she's gone, and you're here, and I refuse to make the same mistake twice." "What if Marcus—" "Marcus is finished." Adrian's voice carried the cold certainty of absolute power. "He may bluster and threaten, but he has no real recourse. The supernatural courts will support our bond, and the human courts won't challenge an alpha king over a minor lord with questionable business practices." "You make it sound so simple." "Because it is simple. We're mates, Lyra, destined for each other. Everything else is just noise." On the 3rd day, they crested a hill, and Ravenshollow spread out before them like something from a fairy tale. The castle rose from the heart of a prosperous valley, its white stone walls gleaming in the afternoon sun, and towers reaching toward the sky like fingers of light. Gardens cascaded down the hillsides in terraces of flowers and fountains, and the town below bustled with activity. "It's beautiful," Lyra breathed. "It's home," Adrian said simply. "Our home." The words sent a thrill through her that she felt all the way down to her toes. "Our home." After a lifetime of being a guest in other people's houses, of always knowing her place was temporary and conditional, the idea of truly belonging somewhere felt like a miracle. They were met at the castle gates by what seemed like half the household. Servants lined the courtyard, their faces bright with curiosity and welcome. Adrian introduced her as his mate and future queen, and Lyra found herself on the receiving end of countless curtsies and respectful smiles. "They seem pleased," she murmured as they climbed the grand staircase toward Adrian's private apartments. "They've been waiting for you for 3 centuries," Adrian said with a smile. "The staff has been placing bets on when I would finally find my mate. Mrs. Hartwell, the head housekeeper, has been particularly vocal about my need for a queen to settle me down properly." Despite her nervousness, Lyra laughed. "And do you need settling down?" "Apparently so." Adrian stopped before a set of ornate doors and turned to face her, his expression growing serious. "These are our rooms, but if you'd prefer separate quarters while you adjust—" "No." The word came out more forcefully than she intended. At Adrian's raised eyebrow, she flushed but continued. "That is, we're mates. I don't want to be apart from you." Something blazed to life in Adrian's eyes at her words, but his voice remained gentle. "Are you sure? There's no pressure, Lyra. We can take this at whatever pace you need." Instead of answering with words, Lyra rose on her toes and pressed a soft kiss to his lips. It was chaste, barely more than a brush of mouth against mouth, but the effect was electric. The golden warmth in her chest exploded into something that felt like coming alive after years of sleepwalking through her own life. When they broke apart, Adrian rested his forehead against hers. "Welcome home," he whispered. The days that followed passed in a blur of introductions, tours, and gentle lessons in royal protocol. Lyra met Adrian's council, a group of older wolves who treated her with respectful curiosity. She was shown through the castle's countless rooms and introduced to the seemingly endless staff. She began learning the basics of running a royal household, though everyone assured her there was no pressure to master everything immediately. But it was the quiet moments that meant the most. Breakfast in their private dining room, where Adrian would read her interesting letters from his correspondence and ask for her thoughts on various kingdom matters. Afternoon walks through the gardens, where he would point out different flowers and tell her their meanings. Evenings by the fire, where they would talk about everything and nothing until the flames burned low. It was during one such evening, a week after their arrival, that Lyra finally voiced the fear that had been growing in the back of her mind. "What if I can't do this?" she asked quietly, her head resting against Adrian's shoulder as they watched the fire. "What if I can't be what your people need?" "You're exactly what they need," Adrian said firmly. "You're what I need." "But I don't know anything about politics or diplomacy or—" "You know about kindness. You know about strength in the face of adversity. You know about standing up for what's right, even when it's terrifying." Adrian's arm tightened around her. "The rest can be learned." "You have so much faith in me." "Because I see who you really are." Adrian pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "And who you really are is extraordinary." It was then that the commotion started, shouting from the courtyard, the clatter of hooves on cobblestones, urgent voices calling for the king. Adrian was on his feet in an instant, his entire demeanour shifting from gentle lover to dangerous predator. "Stay here," he ordered, but Lyra was already rising. "What's wrong?" Before Adrian could answer, Captain Walsh, the head of his personal guard, burst through the doors without ceremony. "Your Majesty," he said, slightly out of breath. "Lord Blackwood is at the gates. He's demanding to see you. Says he has legal papers, a writ of seizure for Lady Lyra." The bottom dropped out of Lyra's world. "He can't. The contracts were voided." "Apparently not all of them," Captain Walsh said grimly. "He claims there was a blood debt clause that supersedes the engagement contract. Something about her father's gambling debts being secured against his daughter's person." Adrian's face had gone terrifyingly cold. When he spoke, his voice was soft and absolutely lethal. "Is he armed?" "Sword only, but he has a dozen men with him." And our response? Awaiting your orders, Your Majesty. Adrian was silent for a long moment, his jaw working as he processed this latest threat. When he looked at Lyra, his eyes were blazing with protective fury. "This ends tonight," he said quietly. "One way or another, this ends tonight." 3 months after her wedding that never was, Lyra stood in the great hall of Ravenshollow, mediating a dispute between two merchant families with the patience of someone who had finally found her place in the world. Gone was the trembling girl who had cowered before Marcus's anger. In her place stood a woman who wore her crown with quiet confidence and spoke with the authority of someone who knew her own worth. "The contract clearly states that payment was due within 30 days, she said calmly, her voice carrying easily through the vast space. "However, Lord Pemberton, your delay was caused by circumstances beyond your control. The bridge collapse that prevented your goods from reaching market on time. Master Blacksmith, while you are entitled to compensation for the delay, perhaps we might find a solution that serves both parties." She proposed a modified payment schedule that would allow Lord Pemberton to fulfil his obligations without bankrupting his family, while ensuring Master Blacksmith received fair compensation plus a small premium for his patience. Both men left the hall satisfied, bowing deeply to their queen. "Well handled," Adrian said, appearing at her elbow as the last petitioner departed. 3 months ago, you would have apologised for existing. Now you're solving problems that have plagued my council for weeks." Lyra smiled, touching the simple gold crown that sat so naturally on her brow now. "I had a good teacher." "You had good instincts. I just helped you trust them." Before Lyra could respond, Captain Walsh approached with his familiar air of controlled urgency. "Your Majesties, there's a situation at the main gate." The golden warmth in Lyra's chest flickered with unease. Over the past 3 months, she had learned to trust her instincts, and something about the captain's tone set her on edge. "What kind of situation?" Adrian asked, though his posture had already shifted into something more alert. "Lord Blackwood, Your Majesty. He's demanding an audience. Claims he has new evidence about the blood debt clause." Lyra felt Adrian tense beside her, his protective instincts flaring to life. But instead of the fear that would have paralysed her months ago, Lyra felt only a cold, clear anger. "How many men with him this time?" she asked. "Just 2 guards, Your Majesty, and he appears to be somewhat worse for wear." Lyra exchanged a look with Adrian. Marcus had made several attempts over the past 3 months to reclaim her, each more desperate than the last. His family's fortune had suffered considerably since losing the Ashford marriage contract, and word from the capital suggested his creditors were becoming increasingly impatient. "Shall I have him escorted from the grounds?" Captain Walsh asked. "No," Lyra said quietly. "I'll see him." "Lyra," Adrian started, but she placed a gentle hand on his arm. "This ends today," she said, echoing his words from months ago. "But it ends with me facing him, not hiding from him." Adrian studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. The throne room, full formal court, let him remember exactly who he's addressing. 20 minutes later, Lyra sat on her throne beside Adrian, wearing the deep blue gown that brought out her eyes and the crown that marked her as Queen of the Northern Territories. The great throne room was filled with courtiers and council members, all watching with barely concealed anticipation as the doors opened to admit Marcus. He looked terrible. His clothes were wrinkled and travel-stained, his face gaunt from too little sleep and too much worry. But his eyes still held that familiar cruel gleam as they fixed on Lyra. "Your Majesties," he said with a bow that managed to be technically correct while still conveying insolence, "thank you for agreeing to see me." "Lord Blackwood," Lyra replied, her voice carrying the calm authority she had spent months learning to trust. "What brings you to our court?" "Justice," Marcus said, straightening to his full height. "I come seeking justice for the wrongs done to me and my family." "And what wrongs might those be?" Adrian's voice was dangerously soft. Marcus pulled a scroll from his coat with trembling fingers. This document proves that my claim to Lady Lyra supersedes even the mate bond, a blood debt signed by her grandfather, pledging his bloodline to the Blackwood family in perpetuity." "I see." Lyra rose from her throne with fluid grace, moving down the steps until she stood directly before Marcus. "And you believe this gives you some claim over me?" "Not some claim," Marcus said, his confidence growing as he sensed what he thought was weakness. "Complete claim. You belong to me, Lyra. You always have." The throne room fell silent, except for the whisper of Lyra's skirts as she moved closer. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the vast space. "You're right about one thing, Marcus. I am bound by my grandfather's debts." She held out her hand. "May I see the document?" Marcus hesitated, then handed over the scroll with obvious reluctance. Lyra unrolled it carefully, reading through the archaic language with the skill of someone who had spent months learning to navigate legal documents. "Fascinating," she murmured. "According to this, my grandfather pledged his bloodline to serve House Blackwood until such time as the debt is paid in full or the bloodline is elevated above the station of the creditor." "Exactly," Marcus said triumphantly. "The debt has never been paid, which means you should have read the fine print more carefully." Lyra's smile was sharp as a blade. "You see, Marcus, when I married the Alpha King, my station was indeed elevated above yours, significantly above yours, which means, according to your own document, the debt is void." Marcus's face went white, then red, then white again. "That's not... You can't..." "Can't what?" Lyra stepped closer, and for the first time in her life, Marcus actually stepped back from her. "Can't read, can't understand basic contract law, can't accept that I am no longer the frightened girl you tried to buy." "You were nothing," Marcus snarled, his composure finally cracking. "You are nothing, a half-blood bastard with delusions of grandeur. You don't deserve—" "Enough." Lyra's voice cracked like a whip, silencing him instantly. Around them, the court watched in fascination as their queen faced down the man who had once terrorized her. "You want to know what I deserve, Marcus? I deserve to be loved instead of owned. I deserve to be cherished instead of controlled. I deserve to be seen as a person instead of property." She moved closer still, forcing him to crane his neck to meet her eyes. "And I deserve the truth." "What truth?" "That you never wanted me for anything more than my bloodline. That you saw a half-blood wolf who could give you children with supernatural abilities, and you thought you could break me down until I was grateful for the privilege of being used." Marcus's silence was confirmation enough. "But here's what you never understood," Lyra continued, her voice soft but carrying the absolute authority of a queen. "You can't break someone who refuses to stay broken. You can't own someone who knows their worth, and you can't force love from someone who has finally learned what real love looks like." She stepped back, returning to Adrian's side with the fluid confidence of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. "Your claim is void," she said formally. "Your presence is no longer welcome in our kingdom. Captain Walsh will escort you to the border, where you will be informed that any future attempts to enter our territory will be considered an act of war." "You can't banish me," Marcus protested. "I have rights." "You have what I give you," Adrian said, rising from his throne with predatory grace. "And I give you nothing but the warning to never threaten my mate again." Marcus looked between them, perhaps finally understanding that he was beaten. His shoulders sagged in defeat, and for a moment Lyra almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "This isn't over," he said weakly. "Yes," Lyra replied gently. "It is." Marcus was escorted from the throne room by Captain Walsh and 2 guards, his footsteps echoing off the marble floors like a funeral march. The court remained silent until the great doors closed behind him, then erupted in whispered conversations and barely concealed excitement. Lyra returned to her throne, settling beside Adrian with a grace that had become second nature. When their fingers intertwined on the armrest between their chairs, the gesture felt as natural as breathing. "That was magnificent," Adrian murmured for her ears alone. "That was necessary," Lyra corrected. "I needed to face him myself, to prove to both of us that I'm not afraid anymore." "And are you afraid?" Lyra considered the question seriously, then smiled. "Of him? No. Of the future, sometimes. Of not being good enough for all this." She gestured around the throne room. "But not of him. Never again." The months that followed were a blur of happiness and growth. Lyra threw herself into her role as queen, establishing programs for half-blood wolves who had been abandoned by their families, creating safe havens for women escaping abusive situations, and working with Adrian's council to strengthen the bonds between supernatural and human communities. Their wedding ceremony took place on the anniversary of their first meeting, in the very garden where Adrian had found her hiding from Marcus's cruelty. This time, Lyra wore a gown of her own choosing, ivory silk that flowed like water and made her feel like the queen she had become. This time, the ring she accepted was given freely, joyfully, with the full understanding of what it meant. "Do you, Adrian Wolfe, take Lyra Ashford to be your mate, your equal, your partner in all things?" "I do," Adrian said, his storm-coloured eyes never leaving hers. "For as long as stars shine and wolves run free." "Do you, Lyra Ashford, take Adrian Wolfe to be your mate, your equal, your partner in all things?" "I do," Lyra replied, her voice strong and sure. "For as long as hearts beat and love endures." When they kissed as husband and wife, the golden warmth that had lived in Lyra's chest for months exploded into something like sunlight, flooding every corner of her being with joy and belonging and home. 1 year later, Lyra stood in the same garden, one hand resting on her gently rounded belly, watching Adrian play with a group of children from the village. The sight of him laughing with the little ones, so patient and gentle despite his fearsome reputation, made her heart swell with love and anticipation. "Brooding about something?" Adrian asked, appearing at her side with the silent grace of his wolf. "Hardly brooding," Lyra said, leaning into his warmth, "just marvelling." "At what?" "At how much can change when you finally choose to trust." She touched her wedding ring, the simple band that had replaced Marcus's ostentatious emerald. "A year ago, I thought this ring was a chain. Now I know it's wings." Adrian's arms came around her from behind, his hands settling protectively over their unborn child. "Any regrets?" Lyra thought of Marcus, reportedly living in exile in the far southern territories, stripped of his titles and most of his fortune. She thought of her parents, who had used Adrian's generous settlement to rebuild their estate and their relationship. She thought of the frightened girl who had once believed she deserved nothing more than a loveless marriage to a cruel man. "Not a single one," she said softly. As if in response to her words, their baby moved beneath her hands, and Adrian laughed with pure delight. The sound echoed through the garden like a promise of all the happiness yet to come, all the love yet to be shared, all the choices yet to be made with confidence and joy. In the distance, church bells began to ring, calling the faithful to evening prayers. But Lyra had already found her church, her sanctuary, her home. It wasn't a place or a building or even a kingdom. It was this: Adrian's arms around her, their child growing safe beneath her heart, and the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, exactly where she had always been meant to be.